Welcome to Lower Hell and Dante's Circle of Violence. My name is Ronald Martinez. I teach Italian studies at the Brown University. And here next to me,
As Bill Caferro, and I teach medieval history at Vanderbilt University.
Canto 12, which is our subject today, is the first canto of the second principal part of Hell, which is basically occupies the rest of the cantica and includes those sins of violence and fraud. Bill, I'd say, I don't know if you agree with me, that there's a lot that this canto has to say to our present condition.
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, yeah. A striking landscape feature immediately grabs our attention. Dante writes in the Durling translation, "The place where we came to descend, the bank was mountainous, like the landslide which struck the flank of the Adige this side of Trento, because of an earthquake or the failing of support. The rocks lie so strewn that they would provide a path for one who was above."
Yeah, and Ron, the Adige Valley in northeastern Italy suffered some violent earthquakes at this time, including a very notorious one that was described by the Florentine chronicler Giovanni Villani and by Petrarch in 1347, which struck along an important trade route going through the Alps that Florentine merchants used. It's been kind of obscured by the Black Death, which happened just afterward, but it was a major event at the time. And Dante's readers, in any case, would have been very familiar with the notion of the earth moving underneath their feet.
Imagine the Black Death obscured a great many things in its day. Virgil goes on to explain the broken rocks as due to an earthquake that took place shortly before a powerful one, crowned with a sign of victory, un possente con segno di vittoria coronato, which was Christ, right, descended into limbo and freed many of the souls there. That was described back in Canto 4. But since Virgil doesn't understand the divine nature of Christ, he explains the quake by invoking an ancient cosmological principle. "If I remember well," he says, "a little before he came, who took from Dis the great spoils of the highest circle, on every side this deep foul valley trembled, so that I thought the universe must be feeling love, by which some believe the world has often been turned back into chaos. Ma certo poco pria se ben discerno che venisse colui che la gran preda levò a ditte del cerchio superno, da tutte parti l'alta valle feda tremò sì, ch'io pensai che l'universo sentisse amor, per lo quale chi creda più volte il mondo in caosso converso." What about that caosso word there?
So Virgil's explanation refers here to Empedocles, a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher that Dante had read about in Aristotle's Physics. Empedocles imagined alternating cycles of attraction and repulsion, love and hate that periodically reorganized the universe. For Empedocles, love, by bringing unlike things together, created chaos, and hate sorted things into more neat categories.
So I guess Virgil figures that the earthquake was the cycle of love kicking in, bringing the rocks of hell, breaking the rocks of hell, bringing chaos. But by saying it was love, Virgil almost gets it right, because for Dante's worldview, the crucifixion was an act of love that did turn the world right upside down. But at the same time, as a deicide, it was the worst act of violence ever perpetrated. One reason why Dante remarks it here.
Yeah, and both the earthquake and Christ's descent afterwards were major events in Dante's universe. Each of the three major zones of hell has a rune that marks the trace of the earthquake. This is important because hell, as we know, endures eternally. And as stated on the famous gate in Canto 3, the crucifixion and its aftermath show that hell can be broken up, as Ron mentioned, by an act that Dante understood as love. For Dante, historical events were providentially ordained and transformative. Chaos changed everything. Contemporary chroniclers like Giovanni Villani, whom I mentioned before, portrayed events, earthquakes, and comets as celestial augurs of earthly change. Virgil thought of cycles of love and hate as typical of ancient cosmological ideas. Dante thinks of the crucifixion as a one-time event, and he uses that word, chaos, once in all of his works, and it's here. Today, if I may talk about this
Yeah.
world. I mean, today we routinely talk about events that change the world. Of course, 9/11 being one of them, and presently the COVID-19 pandemic. The best-selling author slash philosopher economist Nassim Taleb calls these black swans. He's a best-selling author I use in my classes. And what he meant is that these are unpredictable events that move history along in leaps and bounds rather than in a rational, predictable, coherent way that historians usually prefer in their accounts, try to make some meaning out of history. But for Dante, it's only the crucifixion that qualified as truly world-changing.
I suppose Boccaccio, who a few years later witnessed the Black Death, might have had something to say about that, perhaps. And of course, nowadays we see that chaos seems to be benefiting haters more than lovers. If you think about our current situation again. Anyway, the canto brings to the stage vividly imagined monsters and hybrids. They're not the first ones we see in the poem. If you probably remember the snaky-tailed Minos back in Canto 5. But Dante does something special with these. The Minotaur that challenges the wayfarers at the beginning of the canto was supposed to be in classical mythology the offspring of Pasiphae, the daughter of King Minos of Crete, and a bull. Dante does a bit more with the Centaurs, who were, again, in classical mythology, the offspring of Ixion, a tyrant of Thessaly, and a cloud in the shape of the goddess Juno, whom Ixion lusted after. But for Dante, the Centaurs are pretty interesting. What can you tell us about that, Bill?
I mean, Dante's double-breasted centaurs allude again to the cosmology of Empedocles. Love brought things together, but produced strange hybrids like minotaurs and centaurs. And Dante is not just showing his erudition here, which of course he likes to show, but for Dante, the half-human, half-horse centaurs were underworld parodies of the supreme hybrid that defined Christianity, that is, the joining of God and man in the incarnation.
Indeed, and so it's probably relevant that in this canon we find several references to the breast, where the centaurs have the joint or the seam between human and animal. He puts one reference right in the canto's middle line when Chiron looks at his own breast, al petto si mira, and again a few lines later where he talks about the place where the two natures are wedded, dove le due nature son consorti. This might mean that for Dante's concept of the human being, such a seam is the place where the rational part works to control the lower parts of our psyches, the sometimes called the irascible portion of us, the fight or flight syndrome, if we think of it that way, and the concupiscible power, to use a really big word, which is, governing hunger and lust. With the centaurs, Dante seems to be imagining a scene in which a fully rational Virgil can dialogue with a partially rational Chiron, who is in turn a kind of middle point who can actually dialogue or speak or persuade the irrational Pholus and Nessus. And maybe in a larger sense or in a deeper sense, he's thinking of how one governs and pacifies any state, any city, in which reason has to persuade the less pacific impulses, right? That may have something to do with why in this canto we find a bunch of characters whose activities made it pretty much impossible to pacify the state in Dante's lifetime.
Yeah, which makes me think of the militia members. And since Boccaccio's commentary on the Commedia in 1373, readers have interpreted the centaurs as possibility of being militia members or private armies that correspond with the activities of men of violence that Dante refers to in Canto 12. And then even in the 16th century, Machiavelli may in fact have been referring to this canto when he recommended that his prince be like a centaur, employing both brain and brawn and calculation and brute force. The parallels with the present-day America, as Ron brought up at the very beginning, are alarmingly familiar. We watch daily the actions of enablers, of tyrannical deeds, of cynical calculations of politicians, and the official sanction of violence by militia members and government agents who intentionally fan the flames of discord in what has come to resemble the modern version of the Guelph and Ghibelline divisions that tore Dante's Italy apart, and what some may now call a species of culture war.
That focus on the breast as the place where the two natures are joined also alerts us to how Dante conceives of the whole of hell as a giant body. You remember we passed through limbo where we spoke with Aristotle and Plato, or we saw Aristotle and Plato. That's sort of like the head up top. And then we have the middle of it, the thorax or the trunk, where the heart is, where we find ourselves now, the circle of violence. And then further down, the malebolge, which you might consider similar to the viscera or the abdomen. We come now to the second striking landscape image of the canto, the river of blood in which are boiling those who harm others with violence, la riviera del sangue in la qual bolle quel che per violenza in altrui noccia, which Dante will later describe as phlegathon, or Greek for fire flaming. In terms of hell as a great body, the river boiling blood corresponds to the heart, the reservoir of blood for the whole body.
Yeah, an interesting image. And in the canto just before this one, Virgil laid out the content of our circle of the violent. And here I'll cede the words of the poeta to my expert colleague, Ron.
I'll read it in English first, and then in Italian. Death by violence and painful wounds can be inflicted on one's neighbor and on his possessions, ruin, fires, and wrongful extortion, thus homicides and whoever wrongfully strikes, those who lay waste and those who take spoils, all are tormented in the first subcircle. Morte per forza e ferite doliose nel prossimo si danno, e nel suo avere ruine, incendi e tollette dannose, onde omicide e ciascun che malfiere, guastatori e predon, tutti tormenta lo giron primo.
Yeah, and Virgil's categories here reflect forms of destruction by marauders and armies that were all too familiar to Dante, who uses the term, as Ron just mentioned, guastatore, which was very widely used in his time. These were military men, we call them today sappers and pioneers, and I'm not exactly sure why, who set fires and plundered and transgressed the norms of so-called just war. And see Augustine of Hippo for details about what that was. They came from the lowest rung of society. They did things that they were not supposed to do, effectively. And the Florentine armies sent against Pistoia, when Dante was beginning to write the Commedia, had large contingents of guastatori, hundreds of them, and most of the armies that we have put together, been able to put together in the later Trecento, which I've studied, have rely heavily on such men to fight wars.
Well, these are the characters that Dante is going to plunge into the boiling river. He plunges 10 of them. He immerses a pair of ancient Greek rulers, Alexander of Pherae and Thessaly. Thessaly keeps coming up because it was also the place where the Centaurs supposedly had free reign. And Dionysius, the elder of Agrigento in Sicily. These were tyrants who put their hands to blood and to others' goods, that is, to plundering. These two are balanced by a pair of ancient Roman instances, Pyrrhus, a son of Achilles, and the son of Pompey the Great, Sextus Pompeius, a Mediterranean guerrilla pirate after the Roman Civil War of the 1st century BC. They were both held to be degenerate sons of more illustrious fathers.
Yeah, and these ancient examples share space with tyrants from the mid-13th century. So there's a northern grouping, there's Azzolino da Romano, who ruled from Padua, and there's Abizzo d'Este, the lord of Ferrara, that in the northern group. And then there's a southern grouping with Ranier Pazzo of the Pazzi family and Ranier da Corneto, who represent sort of more rurally based lords, although the distinction between urban and rural here is somewhat murky and something we can discuss. But the one thing that the lords all had in common was that they engaged in homicides, in violence, in banditry, and theft. They're bad men.
Right. Between these groups, two figures are set apart by Dante. One is Attila the Hun, mistakenly supposed to have destroyed Florence in the 5th century AD. He's both named and given his well-earned and famous title when Chiron announces, "Over there God's justice pierces the Attila who was a scourge on earth. La divina giustizia di qua punge quell'Attila che fu flagello in terra." The fact that Attila's punishment pierces him like the cords and barbs of a scourge is an instance of that balanced counter-suffering or contrapasso that seems to correspond to Dante's famous logic of infernal punishments. What about the other solitary character, Bill?
The other solitary soul, Ron, is Guido de Monforte, the vicar general of Charles of Anjou in Italy, who murdered Henry of Cornwall in 1271 at Viterbo in revenge for the execution of Guido's father, Simon de Montfort, by King Henry III of England. This is a very famous moment in English history. The victim's father, Richard of Cornwall, was at the time a contender for the imperial crown of the Holy Roman Empire, which is very important to the story. It had been vacant for a number of years at this point. And so it was Henry's advocacy for the father that brought him to Viterbo and to this miserable land.
Yeah, it just gets to a kind of intense moment here, I think, in the canto. Just after giving his list of urban tyrants, Ezzelino and Obizzo d'Este, as you said, almost as if cued by the fact that Obizzo was murdered by his, or supposedly murdered by his bastard son, his figliastro, Virgil turns over his authority as a guide to Chiron. Let him now be first for you, he says to the pilgrim, and I second. Questo ti sia or primo ed io secondo. This extraordinary delegation of authority gives enormous emphasis to what follows. Dante has Chiron point to a soul by itself on one side, that is to Guido, and say, that one cleft in the bosom of God, the heart that still so drips blood along the Thames. Colui fesse in grembo a Dio lo cor che in su tamisci ancor si cola. This then is the bleeding heart of hell. Chiron need not name either assassin nor victim, since the scandal of the murder of Henry still reverberated in Dante's day, not just for the scandal. Chiron refers to a legend that Henry's heart, preserved in a shrine in London near the Thames, continued to bleed, a sign that his murder was unavenged, and so it remained. The expression cleft in the bosom of God refers to the fact that Henry was murdered in church at Mass, gripping the altar, at the moment of the consecration of the Eucharistic host, when Christ, according to Catholic doctrine, is actually present in the Eucharistic bread. When Christ, Dante marks the exact moment of violence, sacrilege, which, like Christ's crucifixion, was a precise moment in history, by inscribing a sign of Christ's actual presence. By saying that Henry's heart still bled into the Thames, Dante brings the memory of that sacrilege into his own moment.
Yeah, and God's bosom here may even refer to the city of Viterbo itself, where a papal election had been underway since 1268. And that drew together princes and churchmen from throughout Europe, including Charles of Anjou and the King of France, Henry III, and other notables. And Henry III was carrying the bones of his father, St. Louis, who had died along the road to the crusade in Tunis, which has failed, which was what brought these men to Viterbo. And Viterbo was on a major medieval pilgrim and commercial road. This was called the Via Francigena. And it connected Paris to Rome, so that Viterbo was a nerve center of Italy, and in effect, the papal seat in Italy after the Curia left in 1309.
So Dante seems to think of the murder of Henry as planting this kind of scandal and sacrilege at the very heart of Christendom.
Yeah, absolutely. And in Guido de Monforte, the murderer, we'd argue here that shouldn't be read merely as an English external figure to Italy. He was deeply involved in political dynamics in Italy and in Europe and the Mediterranean more generally. And in fact, numerous characters here within Italy as well are connected in various ways throughout Europe and the Mediterranean in a larger sense. In the case of Guido, he was married to Margherita, who was the daughter of Ildebrandino Aldobrandeschi, who was the head of a powerful clan, allied with Charles of Anjou, directly involved in Henry's murder. We hear more about the members of the Aldobrandeschi clan later in Dante's poem, and none of it is good. All of it is negative. And Dante was simply documenting a network of alliances that, in his view, were destroying the Italy of his day.
Makes you want to think also of the crowd of scuzzy enablers around our current president.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Within 60 years of the murder of Henry, Dante's early commentators were comparing him to Christ. And given how Dante's Canto unfolds, I think the implication is there that was Dante's view as well. For Dante, the murder marked a plague of cruelty and injustice. In our own moment, we have seen how a vicious crime can galvanize and revolutionize public opinion, although a world, God knows, and 7 centuries of difference separate an English prince and a black man from 21st century Minneapolis. It's interesting to see how the murder by a squad of policemen of George Floyd can, in just 9 minutes of violence, a single moment in history, reveal the pattern of racially based violence, and impunity that have become routine in American life. Whether this murder remains unpunished, Bill, we don't know. We won't know for a while. And so we'll have to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and that brings Dante, sadly, right up to date.
So it does. Yeah. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you.